talking today with Bob Marshall of Santa Rosa, California. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Mr. Marshall, can you start by telling us a little bit about your background? Where were you born, for instance?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, July 17th, 1928.
All right, and what did your family do?
My father died when I was 8. It was the height of the Depression. My mother was an immigrant from Germany. My father an immigrant from Ireland, so kind of an unusual combination. But anyhow, and she, at the time, after my father died, it was difficult to get a job. She finally got a job as a maid in the Canterbury Court Hotel in Chicago.
And where was that?
Canterbury Court was on the north side of Chicago. Clark Street, someplace around there.
All right. And so what kind of living conditions did you have?
We lived in a Cold War flat on Sheffield Avenue and near North Side.
How close to Wrigley Field?
Not far. Slight diversion. When I was about 9 years old, I discovered I could get a free pass to Wrigley Field if I showed up the day before, after the game, and they'd give you a gunny sack that big, and we'd clean out all the paper cups and peanut bags and stuff like that until we filled up the sack, and we got a free pass for the next day's game. So I saw a lot of the Cubby games, and probably can still recite the lineup from the 38-39 Cubs. Yeah, pretty close.
Yeah, but you're not old enough to have seen him win a World Series.
Not many people alive today are old enough to have seen a World Series.
All right. Now, did you finish high school?
No, I didn't finish high school. I graduated. I went to a parochial school, a Lutheran parochial school, and finished that and started Lane Tech. The war was on, so I took the opportunity to trade up from a paper route to the best job I could get by lying about my age and telling people I was already 16. I was a tall, skinny kid, so even if they didn't believe me, they wanted to believe me because I could do a day's work, I guess. And so I got a job and it helped supplement the family income.
What job did you take?
Well, I worked in a cold storage warehouse for a while. And they finally found out how old I really was, so that didn't last. Then I worked for the Davy Tree Company as a tree skinner, helping to cut down trees and trim trees and all that sort of stuff. And by that time I was 16. In May of 1944, President Roosevelt signed an executive order lowering the age of inductees into the Maritime Service, Merchant Marine Training Organization, to 16. And when I heard that, I went down and got the paperwork and brought her home, and it took me about 2 weeks to convince my mother to sign it. She signed it, and I remembered we had to get it notarized, get her signature notarized, and we took it down to the local undertaker, Nick Stitch. He had an office on Center Street in Chicago's near North Side. He signed it, and my mother said she really wasn't sure she wanted me to go. And Nick Stitch said, "Mother, you'll come back safe and sound. Don't you worry about it."
All right. Now, what motivated you to join the Merchant Marine?
Oh, it was peer pressure, or just the influence of the feeling we were at war and everybody had to do something. Patriotism is kind of a tired word, but I guess that boils down to it more than anything else.
And you couldn't enter any of the other branches of the service at that point.
Too young.
I was too young. So.
And also lacking in a high school education, and so.
All right. Now, did they ship you off then to Sheepshead Bay? Was that where you went?
I went to Sheepshead Bay. I went through boot camp in Sheepshead Bay.
And what was that like for you?
I enjoyed it very much. The discipline, surprisingly, the routine of 3 regular nutritious meals a day, a lot of exercise and so forth. And I probably didn't weigh 130 pounds when I got there. I beefed up a little bit. I was a tall, skinny kid, so it didn't hurt to have a little meat on my bones. And I felt better than I probably had ever felt in my life in terms of health. They gave us a battery of tests up there to see whether we wanted to go to the deck department, the engine department, or the storage department, what we wanted to do. I scored very high. In fact, on the IQ test, I finished before anybody else in the room. It was probably 60 or 70 of us taking the test. And the yeoman that was proctoring the test called me up to the front and said, "Stand there while I score this." He says, and he was amazed, and he says, "You're off the charts." He says, "Did you know that?" And I says, "No." I didn't have the biggest idea. But I read a lot, and I guess self-education, again, is kind of a cliche, but I was more self-educated than probably a lot of my peers at my age. So they gave me a choice of where I wanted to go. Well, I was too young to go to any of the deck officers training schools or the engine officer training schools, but they let me go to Hoffman Island. And I was 16 when I got to Hoffman Island still. And,
describe Hoffman Island. What was that?
The first word that comes to my mind with Hoffman Island is it was cold. I arrived there in late November, early December, I think, someplace around there. And you left from Manhattan, took the Staten Island ferry across to Staten Island, then took the 200-volt trolley, which was the Staten Island Railway, around to South Bay, and then got on the Mayflower, which is the launch that took us out to the island. And of course, in the middle of December, being out on the water, and we had peacoats, which were very, very warm and so forth, but still, you know, you weren't the kind of clothing that was comfortable. So it was cold getting on the island, and it seemed every morning we were there for the first couple of weeks that at 6 o'clock in the morning, you know, the bugler went off, and in our t-shirts and dungarees, we were out on the parade ground around doing calisthenics, which in the long term probably didn't hurt us at all, but in the short term seemed like, why did I ever get into this kind of a routine?
Okay. And what sort of daily routine did they have for you there?
Well, it was classes divided between code, learning the code, Morse code, and theory. You learn the basics of what made radios work, circuitry, the P equals I divided by R, or something like that, or so on. And we, it was interesting. It was intellectually challenging for me. I enjoyed it very much, and I learned quickly, and I grasped the theory part of it, and did very well on that. I had a little bit of trouble with code. It came a little slowly. The kids that were musicians and had learned how to play musical instruments did very well, and couldn't understand why the rest of us didn't pick it up equally as well. There were a few of us, and they made us practice evenings and Saturdays, Sundays, we didn't have liberty and so on. But eventually I did master it well enough to graduate, and I came out as a warrant radio electrician in the Maritime Service.
Okay. Now, while you were there and you got liberty, did you go into New York City? And
yeah, I did.
And what did you do there?
Well, I got to know New York City very much. We soon discovered that there were places where we weren't welcome, and there were places we were very welcome. And when there were places which were relatively inexpensive and places which were very expensive. So you began to sort out that I can afford to go here, or this is where I want to spend my Saturday afternoon or Sunday morning. And one of the places I found was that the Markville Collegiate Church on South Park Avenue had a serviceman center, and they welcomed the kids in the Maritime Service, whether we were from Sheepshead Bay in boot camp or from Hoffman Island in the radio officer school. And it was a good place to hang out, and you met a lot of wonderful people, and it was kind of nice.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, once you graduate, and so when did you graduate from
I
Hoffman
got out
Island?
in April. We left Hoffman Island. I left Hoffman Island in April. Went back to Chicago for a week's leave,
Mm-hmm.
and boarded a train, and went out to Seattle on the Great Northern Railway. Wove up and through Canada,
Right.
North Border, and through Banff. I saw the Rockies for the first time and was absolutely fascinated. There were mountains like that in this life and world and so on. And it was kind of an adventure.
Mm-hmm. And then you get out to Seattle.
Got to Seattle, and I was fortunate that I signed on as the third radio operator, a radio officer on board a Liberty ship, the SS Stephen Furtick. And we loaded in Tacoma. Two of my classmates, Sid Cripshaw, and Sid was 28 years old. He was old for Hoffman Island. And most of us were a number of kids my age, 16, 17, 18.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was a group that had gotten out of high school, and for one reason or another, they were 18, 19, 20. But then that was it. That was about the top of the age bracket.
Okay, here I'm going to pause and let this.
Be at ease without me there.
Good. So Sid was chief operator because of his age and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. Howie had lived in Kirkland, Washington, so he reported to the ship about 2 hours before we did, or I did. So he was second, I was third. And we loaded cargo in Tacoma.
What kind of cargo do you know?
Yeah, it was mostly telephone poles, telephone wires, cement bags, these roll-up runways that they use for emergency landing fields and things like that. And then took off middle of the night, and we went out through the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And it's first time at sea. And the straits outside the Seattle, Vancouver area there is a kind of choppy, rough place to be. And the ship started to roll and pitch a little bit. And a lot of the people who had never been to sea before got seasick, and for whatever the reason, I was too young to know any better to get seasick. I didn't, and I just loved every minute of it. It was fantastic. We went down the coast of Washington, Oregon to Southern California, California to Southern California, and pulled into Port Hueneme, which was the CB base, and loaded deck cargo. And we loaded flatbed truck trailers, and some other boxes that they stowed right on the deck that had also some of this runway material on, this temporary runway material. And took off with that. We were loaded up right up to the bridge deck, so that it looked like a box almost in silhouette. And they didn't let us ashore in Port Hueneme. We loaded in the middle of the night. We were loaded by noon the next day and took right off. Uneventful trip to Eniwetok. Great experience getting into the routine of the ship and standing watches and feeling very important as a 16-year-old officer and that sort of stuff.
What was the captain like? Was he reasonable?
Captain was a very quiet man. He was 72, 73 years old, and he was British. And he was a man of rather small stature, about 5'3" or 5'4", and very dedicated man and a good sailor, good seaman. He slept in the chart room once we got past Hawaii and into waters where there were submarines and there was concern and so forth. And one of the things I remember most is if he came by, of course, he tiptoed when he was sleeping, and you saw him in there, and so. But you always saw that he had taken his false teeth and put them on the side of the settee that was in there. And Captain Hughes was his name. He was a good man. He was a good man.
Right. Now, what time of year was this now?
This was April, May,
Spring of 45 then.
spring of 45, we arrived in Annie-Weetalk, and we were all absolutely floored when we saw the number of ships that were in the atoll, in the center of the atoll there at Anchorage. And this was obviously a staging area. A lot of the war in the Pacific, we had no real concept of the grand strategy of what was going on or anything, but you just had that feeling that something big was going to happen, something grand and large in scale was going on. So we stayed in Annie-Weetalk for, I guess, a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, and then they dispatched us off to Guam. We got to Guam, again, an uneventful trip. It was...
Now, were you going in convoy or by yourself?
By ourselves. We were sailing independently. And we were nervous about that. Everybody on board was a little nervous about that. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things that you weren't sure about, and why weren't we in convoy? A number of other officers on board had sailed on the Atlantic in convoys, and that was the way to have a safe passage, is be in a large convoy with a large number of escorts. And here we took off in the middle of the night and saw no one or nothing, and got out there and sighted no other ships or had no radio communication, and got to Guam, and that was it.
Now, did you unload Guam?
No, we ultimately did, but at that point we anchored in Guam, and by now it was July. I'd spent my 17th birthday in a week here, so we must have left there mid-July. I was born July 17th. So we got to Guam. It was probably around the 1st of August, late July, last week in July, first week of August. And we were at Anchorage in Guam with this big, monstrous, ugly-looking deck cargo. And authorities had tracked a typhoon that was coming close to Guam, and they were concerned about all the ships at Anchorage. So they were dispatching the ships that were at Anchorage out to sea where they'd be safer in the event the typhoon hit and so on. And then they got to us, and we were supposed to be dispatching. They took one look at all this deck cargo and decided that this was just chaos. So they moved us into a dock to unload us. And while we were at the dock, apparently the meteorological report was changed, and they decided it wasn't going to come close to there. So we sat at the dock for a couple of days, and they unloaded all the deck cargo, and they finally unloaded the cargo we had in the holds. And by now, the B-29s were just beating up on Japan. Everybody was very confident that the war was going to be over fairly soon, and so on. Once they started to unload us, everybody let out a collective sigh of relief that we weren't going to be part of an invasion, it looked like, or at least at that time. That was, the happy rumors, and there was a lot of rumors in life. So we were dispatched back to the United States, and we had several naval officers on board as passengers, and in addition to the naval gun crew. We were all pretty excited about getting home, and we were at sea when we heard about the bomb. And I remember I had the 8 to 12 watches, the third radio officer. And after I got off watch at midnight one night, I went up to the flying bridge. It was a moonlight night, and it was just as clear and beautiful as could be, and there's only the Pacific, the stars, like being in a planetarium dome. It was almost artificial looking. And several of the officers were up there with one of the Navy lieutenants who was our passenger, and we were talking about it, and I was doing a lot of listening. I didn't know what was going on, and neither did anybody else. But they were speculating, and they decided that, that was the end of the war, essentially, and it was all over with. They were going to sign a peace treaty, apparently in just a matter of days or so. We arrived in San Francisco 2 days after VJ Day, and it was kind of a heady experience. We, all of the military that had been in barracks or stationed in and around San Francisco had been confined to barracks after the VJ Day celebration, which had not done the town a lot of good. And so we pretty well had the town to ourselves, and anybody in uniform, you know, I was only 17, but you know, you couldn't go into a bar and they wouldn't hand you a beer, and you couldn't pay for it. In fact, you couldn't go into a restaurant and pay for a meal those days. I mean, it was just, the world was turned topsy-turvy and everybody was just happy. And nobody really thought much about the future, but it was the here and now in a big way.
All right. Now the war is over at this point. Now, were you signed on for a certain length of time to stay in the Merchant Marine, or do you get to just decide from
They
trip to
signed
trip?
us off at the ship. You signed articles when you got on the ship. You actually were terminated in the maritime service, and you signed articles, and your contract was with that ship and for the duration of that voyage, wherever that might be. They signed us off in San Francisco. I think it must have been a week or so after we'd arrived. We were docked right down in the Embarcadero, almost at the foot of Market Street, Pier 54 or something like that. Don't ask me how I remember things like that. Anyhow, and you couldn't get on a train, you couldn't get an airplane. People weren't flying anyhow in those days much. And we finally got on a bus ticket, and Sid and I headed back to Chicago. He continued on to New York, and I got up in Chicago and spent a month at home with family. And after that, decided to continue to sail. And I went to New York, went to the Radio Officers Union Hall, and was assigned as second radio operator on another Liberty ship, the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and she was a converted troop transport. And we sailed between New York, Boston, and Antwerp, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and picked up troops that had enough points and were being sent home. I made, I guess 4 or 5 trips that fall and early next winter, and that was a terrible winter on the North Atlantic. It was just one gale, one storm after another. It was pretty brutal. We brought back a number of troops from Antwerp, I think was where they boarded, that were in Patton's headquarters, one of the headquarters companies of Patton's unit, our 3rd Armored Division. And while we were at sea on the way back, word of Patton's death reached us, and that was a bit of a sad thing for those troops, because they were all excited about getting home for Christmas that year, and this sort of dampened everybody's spirits.
Yeah. Now, when you got over to Europe, did you get much of a chance to get off the boat and see what things were like in those ports you stopped at?
Yeah, I got off in Le Havre, learned about Calvados and France, and was neither disappointed nor surprised in the sort of disorganization and lack of stability of the local population or the economic situation or anything else. Most of us, I think, kind of expected something like that. And the same thing when we got to Antwerp and Amsterdam and Rotterdam.
Yeah. Well, Antwerp had been hit pretty hard.
Very bad. The waterfront in Antwerp was just it looked like one disaster after another. From one pier, 2 or 3 piers would be standing or something like that, and the next 2 or 3 would be all damaged and bombed out and rubble all over the place. Yeah.
And how did the local population seem to be faring, as far as you can tell?
That was a tough winter for them. They had a lot of troubles and a lot of difficulty, and they were all happy the war was over, obviously, whenever you met or talked to people, but there was a real recognition on how impoverished they were and how difficult it was and how the shortages of food were. The currency was cigarettes. A pack of cigarettes was almost a pack of gold in terms of currency or what its value was. And it was both sad and Christmas time, the first Christmas after the war, was essentially a happy time, but a time of really deep, what now type of thing. The uncertainty was palpable. You could feel it when you talked to people.
In general, what did they seem to think of Americans?
During those years, I never met anybody that thought anything except the nicest and the best things. And I'm sure that it wasn't all just altruistic good thought. I think a lot of it was that they looked westward towards the United States for their economic survival and benefit, and saw us in some ways as a long-term meal ticket. But there was also a real deep gratitude, I think, on most people, the fact that we were serving and what we were doing and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, on those trips over to Europe, were you taking food or relief supplies or things like that over and then bringing the soldiers back?
While I was on the troop ship, no. It was just bring troops back. We carried virtually no cargo at all. I mean, some high-value items maybe, but virtually nothing. I went home that year after Christmas and spent Christmas at home, and then went back and for the next year sailed on another Liberty ship. It was a straight cargo ship that was operated by the Atlantic Gulf and West Indies lines, the SS Stephen W. Galbraith. And our home port was Savannah. And we sailed to Antwerp and Amsterdam, Rotterdam also, so I made probably, another half a dozen trips on her. And that ship, we had some interesting cargo. We loaded up in Portland, Maine one time, nothing but potatoes, and they filled that ship stem to stern, potatoes in the holds. And I mean, it was just the most unbelievable number of potatoes I've ever seen in my life, red potatoes. We got into Antwerp, after we loaded, we were fully loaded and left. We were in Antwerp 7-8 days later, I think, and unloading it, and some of the potatoes had already started to spoil. It got salt water in the holes and that sort of stuff. But for the most part, they were just loading them on, dumping them on trucks, and they weren't in bags or anything. They just took them up in scoops and put them up and taking them off. And it was those kinds of cargoes that I think Europe really needed that winter to survive that winter. On the way back from that trip to Antwerp, it was a fascinating story. We were halfway across the Atlantic, and there was only one radio operator, and that was me. And it was the first ship I'd sailed on as the sole operator, chief operator officer. And I probably wasn't the fastest or the best there was, and felt the responsibility of being that. About halfway across the Atlantic on our way back, we got a change of orders. Instead of going back to Savannah as we had originally been scheduled, we were diverted to Dingwall, Nova Scotia, which is up in the Cape Breton Islands. And I remember that I brought the typed out message into the captain with this diversionary schedule, and he and the second mate came and grabbed me out of the radio room and said, "Are you sure? Get a repeat of the message." And I said, "Sure what?" And he says, "Dingwall." I never heard of Dingwall. Nobody had ever heard of Dingwall. So they didn't have charts. They couldn't find it on a chart. And so they finally found what they thought would be it based on whatever it is. So a message went back, and latitude, longitude, pilot information, all that sort of stuff. I wouldn't say terrified, but I was most certainly concerned that, did I make a mistake? Didn't I make a mistake? Here everybody's relying on my accuracy for this and so forth. But it was right, and we got into Dingwall. It turned out there was maybe 20 houses in this little village up on the western shore, one of the Cape Breton Islands, and there was was a gypsum mine there. Same thing as they loaded the potatoes. There was no boxes, there was sacks or anything of the gypsum. They just dumped it in the holes, and it took us a couple of 3 days to load up. And I went ashore. There wasn't anything to see ashore. There was a dozen houses, and it was just the crew that worked the docks and the mine, and that was about it. And I took off on a hike just to stretch my legs, and I went about a quarter of a mile outside of the town, and the two-rut road turned into a path, and the path sort of wandered off in a direction. I thought, oh, I'm up in the North Woods, go backwards, warm and safe. So we got back into Savannah with that, and they got a lot of the gypsum out of the ship, but they didn't get the stuff where the bilges had leaked and it solidified on the bottom. And they tried with jackhammers and everything else, and finally decided the ship had to go to the shipyard, so we all got signed off and discharged on that. And the crew had all been from around the Georgia area, the officers, part of the crew, I should say. And Captain Strobert, they were all from some little town up in central Georgia. Captain, chief mate, second mate, and one of the engineers, I think the first engineer. And in any event, he was assigned a brand new Victory ship, and he asked me if I'd go along and sign on to the Victory. So I signed on to Savannah on the Laredo Victory, and I sailed on her for almost a year, and again the same route to the northern ports of the Netherlands and Belgium, northern ports. And we, instead of coming back to Savannah every trip, we came back on the Victory into Baltimore and New York. We came into New York periodically on that one. So that took me, I guess, through 46 into 47. In the spring of 47, I went back to Sheepshead Bay on the radar and electronics school. And, in the meantime, I had started taking courses through the U.S. Merchant Marine Correspondence School. And I'd taken courses in maritime law, algebra, English comp, and a number of other things. And I read voraciously, stood a lot of night watches, and read all the time I was on watch. Every time a box of books arrived on board ship, I went down and got the best 15, 20 books I could, and that had lasted me for 2 or 3 weeks and no more of it. So, made a trip out to the West Coast after another leave at home in Chicago, and picked up a brand new C2 out of the Wilmington shipyards, the SS Crest of the Wave.
And what's a C2?
C2 is a larger than a Liberty ship, cargo ship, designed during the World War II period and constructed during the World War II period, so it was a more modern ship. Liberty ship was actually designed World War I, post-World War I, and just never built. I mean, but it was based on old design. And the C2 is a more substantial ship. And in those days, I think there was still a mental attitude among the lawmakers in Washington that the United States Merchant Marine was going to be competitive in a worldwide situation, that in the post-World War period, that American bottoms were going to take a lot of cargo all over the world, and merchant service we'd built up was going to endure and all that. So it was the first ship I'd sailed on where it wasn't painted gray. It had the Aguilines colors on it. It was black hull and white superstructure, which was just elegant compared to what we'd sailed on before, that kind of a thing. And it also had larger quarters and so forth. It was nice. I liked it. I sailed through the Caribbean on that. Cuba, made a couple of trips to Cuba, and up to Savannah, and then back to Cuba again. Stopped in Panama on the trip around. Signed off of that. 47, mid 47, something like that, late 47. And decided I was going to get a job ashore. By now I was 18, going on 19, I think, or 19, just turned 19. I was an old man.
Mm-hmm.
Had to look to my future, I think. So I went ashore in Chicago and got a job in a factory that made loudspeakers, and this lasted for a couple of months. And I found working on assembly line boring,
Mm-hmm.
and not very happy about it. And decided to ship out again because it was something I enjoyed and loved. Went to New York and signed on a tanker. It was the old Harry F. Sinclair Jr. She'd been built in the 1920s
Mm-hmm.
and had a hull made of half-inch steel and riveted, not welded,
Mm-hmm.
which was a ship of substance. She'd been torpedoed off of Ambrose Light outside of New York in 43, I think, early 43, maybe mid 43, and the Navy had gone out to sink her and use her for target practice because she hadn't sunk. And they shelled her for something like 20 hours and she wouldn't sink, so they towed her into the Todd shipyards in West New York, and West New York, New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
and started to rebuild her, and it was an on and off kind of a thing from 43, 44, and I went all through the end of the war. And then finally at the end of the war they finished her up, finished the contract, and didn't know what to do with her, so the War Assets Administration put her up for sale. Rechristened her the Annibal, SS Annibal, A-N-N-I-B-A-L. And three old skippers pooled their savings, put up a couple of $100,000 and mortgaged the rest and bought her.
Mm-hmm.
And then signed a contract with Exxon, which is now Exxon, I guess it was Esso in those days, Standard of Ohio, or Standard Oil.
Mm-hmm.
And got a bareboat charter, and we ran coastwise between New England ports, Tiverton, Rhode Island, Boston, Albany, New York, of all places, and Baytown, and Galveston, and just back and forth like that. Well, she was an old ship, and even though they'd rebuilt a lot of her and put new engines in her, she broke down a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was kind of exciting. I was radio officer and purser. It was a one-ship company.
Mm-hmm.
So, save a buck here, save a buck there, save one mouth to feed and one wage to pay, and I got the job. So we had a Norwegian skipper, Tweakram, Captain Tweakram, Tweekram, Tweakram. And good skipper, good sailor, good seaman, but the poor guy couldn't stand the sight of blood, so one of the first things he told me kind of in confidence was, he says, I'm not very good at doctoring things on board ship, so here's the key to the medicine chest. He says, if anybody ever needs anything, you take care of it for me. And oh, by the way, here's the book, which was the Medicine at Sea manual. Had been written in the 1920s or 30s, I guess, and probably updated during the war. And gave it to me, and I put it in the Radio Shack. And, never thought much about it. And by now, of course, I was an old sailor and so on. Well, that was probably the most interesting year of my life on board that ship. Working 10, 12 hours a day, payrolls, which I'd never done before. He showed me once, and that was it. Ullage reports, which are, what tanks are loaded to what level, and that kind of stuff, which you sent in. And then the ailments of the grief and aggravation of the seamen, stomach problems, this, that, and so on, which was fairly easy. And because we were running coastways, we had no morphine on board. We didn't ever have to clear customs, so there was no way of sealing the medicine chest and that kind of stuff. So any kind of an accident on board, it was, skipper would come down and put a bottle of whiskey on my desk and say, here, feed him this, and that was it. Then he'd get out of the room before any of the blood splattered. But we had an engineer who smashed off a finger. I fixed that up for him. We had a bosun that got laid on an angle iron by a heavy see, took part of his scalp, which was just, the flap was flapping off. And I shaved that and tinctured green soap and used a lot of tincture methylate to clean out the wound, and then stitched it up with catgut and curved needles. And when the public health doctor came on board in Staten Island, took one look at it and says, "My God, where the hell did you ever learn to do this?" And I said, "My mother taught me how to sew," and so forth. He says, "Obviously," he says, "nobody in the medical profession ever do this." But all he had was a big scar, and was a big square-head bosun. He was also Norwegian. He was a robust kind of a gentleman, nice guy. One of the stories I remember about that ship, and probably I've never told anybody this story in my whole life, I think. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I don't think I ever understood it. We spent Christmas at sea, Christmas of '47, and we were sailing light going south around Florida. We were off the coast of Miami, southern Florida, and you can see the lights of that part of Florida on the horizon as we passed by. And Captain Tweakram came down to the radio shack and said that he was going to provide some punch for the men after Christmas dinner that night. And would I come down to the mess room and speak to the men afterwards? And I said, "Why me?" And he says, "Well," he says, "you went to a Lutheran school. And he says, you know the right words about the Christmas story. Would you tell it to them?" Well, here are these guys. They were hanging out in Baytown. They knew every whorehouse in town. I was bailing them out of jail. They were a bunch of drunks, as most merchant sailors are, and so forth. And I thought to myself, I can't do this. So anyhow, I got down there. Anyhow, the captain had asked me. And so he, in his typical broken Norwegian English and type thing, wished them all a Merry Christmas and said that he'd only taken a half a bottle of bourbon and he'd just put it in this big bowl of punch, so there wasn't enough to get anybody drunk, so don't try and drink all the punch. And and then he went back and sat in the back of the room. And he says, "Sparks is going to tell you the Christmas story." He says, "It's only appropriate." He says, "We do something religious tonight." And he says, "I know we're not going to say any prayers," but he says, "Well, having gone to a Lutheran school, we had a Christmas pageant every year, so I memorized the whole Christmas story, and Joseph and Mary went to Galilee, and the three wise men, and the whole story about the baby in the manger." And I got up there and recited the whole thing. It was dead silence when I finished. You could hear a pin drop, and the silence continued, and the silence continued, and it must have lasted for a minute or a minute and a half. It seemed like an hour and a half. Nobody said anything. I got nervous, and I turned around and I walked out. And I walked out on deck, and I walked all the way up to the bow of the ship, and I stood up there, and you could see the phosphorescent wave coming up on the side. It seemed to me at that time that it was time that I'm going to make a decision in my life. That I was either going to leave the sea or I was going to stay here for the rest of my life. So I went ashore and never went back. Probably the right decision.
So what did you do next?
Well, I went to work for RCA. I installed televisions in New York when it was an exciting time. Nobody had television, little 10-inch screens. And, Korean War came around and they packed me off. RCA personnel found out I'd been to radar and electronics school, and they packed me off to Japan as a tech rep. And I taught Army Signal Corps people how to run radars and how to repair them. Came back and went to work for IT&T, worked for them for 25 years, and worked myself up from field technical representative to project engineer, sales engineer,
Now, how long did they have you in Japan?
I was in Japan for a year.
And what was it like living there at that point?
It wasn't bad. I lived in the BOQ, in the Bachelor Officer Quarters, on board on a Air Force base,
Mm-hmm.
Johnson Air Force Base. Traveled around a lot to all of the radar sites we had. The peacetime army in the period between the end of World War II and the Korean War had lost a lot of its technical skills. A lot of the radars didn't work. The parts been sitting in the warehouse since the 40s, and they didn't work either. And so getting them back on the air, teaching the guys how to maintain them was a very difficult thing. There was about 35 or 40 of us over there. And it was a tough period. It was a tough working environment. It was a difficult life. A lot of the uncertainty that you'd felt during the war, World War II for me, re-emerged, remanaged, started all over again. So we were in the government service division at that time, and when I left that, left RCA, I went back to the States and decided I was going to get another job, and I went to work for IT&T and wound up in the government service division there. The same things, same government electronics equipment, only this time different kind of equipment. It was airborne equipment. It was electronic countermeasures devices, and I stayed in that job. Actually flew with the Strategic Air Command for 2.5 years. We installed it on board some of the SAC bombers out of Biggs Air Force Base. I flew RB-50s, RB-29s. I went to the right pad on the flight test program. I was part of the flight test program on the RB-47H. We installed the equipment after we'd prove it. Went to England with an RB-50 aircraft. It was a squadron that rotated through Lake and Heath Air Force Base, and we flew missions along the Eastern Europe Soviet border to pick up their radar signals and pinpoint their search radar and their gunline, or the radar they used to control and vector their fighters in. Flew 2 or 3 missions there with them. Every time I got on the airplane to fly one of those missions, it was empty your pockets, no identification, no nothing, and that sort of a thing. It was, fortunately I was young enough not to know any better, I guess. I was less than 30, I was only about 27, 28. But again, it was a point in my life where you reach that stage where you say, hey, I gotta make a decision, I gotta do something else, this isn't working for me. So I went back to the States after this. I was invited, this was probably one of the proudest moments of my life. I was invited to come back to Omaha when the crew went back to Omaha to SAC, and the crew was mustered on the flight line in front of the aircraft we were flying in. It was an RB-50, and we had these crazy wild antennas on it. You could recognize any place. How the hell it was ever a top secret type of operation, I'll never know. And General Montgomery was the executive officer of SAC, and he came out in a Jeep first, and then LeMay came out. And LeMay gave all of the crew members air medals or distinguished flying crosses, and I was the only guy in civilian clothes there, and standing on the side, and LeMay went over to Montgomery and says, "Who the hell is that?" Montgomery said he has been with these guys for the last 6 months, and never a yes, no, buy your leave, or go to hell or anything, just nodded his head and he left. That was it. But it was a good experience in my life. Not an unhappy experience, but not one I'd ever do again, or not ever do if I was old enough to know any better. Went back into the office, into headquarters office, and went into sales engineering. Became regional sales manager, then sales manager, and then vice president of sales, and then finally vice president of marketing for that division in the government service. And they sent me over to the labs as vice president of marketing after that. vice president. Then I became general manager of the communications and electronics division at the labs, which was kind of exciting. I mean, I was a kid, never finished high school.
Yeah.
I had half a dozen PhDs working for me, and probably 300 engineers, and it supports that. Then I I worked for Hal Janine at ITT, and he fired me twice, and the third time I was about to be fired, and a good friend of mine interceded for me, and I was assigned to Latin America. I was vice president of Latin America for 8 years, and I stayed with him through 1972, 3, about then. And ITT closed their Latin America division. You remember the fiasco in Chile and the church hearings and all that sort of nonsense. And they were going to sign me over to Europe and then into Africa and the Middle East, essentially a lateral transfer across. And my wife said to me, I had been married fairly recently. It was my second marriage. And she said to me, you've always wanted to go to school. Why don't you go to college? So I did. So I left ITT, and I signed a consulting contract with him. I went back summers and finished Wartime in a year and a half, got a bachelor's, went to Yale, got 2 graduate degrees at Yale, an MA and an MPhil.
And what did you take the degrees in?
Political science, which was very practical. Gave me a great insight into things like the election and so forth. I never taught political science. First teaching job I had, I applied for the job in the political science department, and they sent me over to the business school, and I got a job teaching management in Pace University, a tenure track job teaching management there, and my wife got a teaching fellowship out to UC Santa Barbara, so we sat down, and I said, well, you did it for me once, I'll do it for you this time. So I resigned my tenure track job, and off we went to Santa Barbara. So we spent 2 years in Santa Barbara, and I was kind of gypsy teaching there. I taught it in University Extension at UC Santa Barbara. I taught at the same time at Redlands University in their Master of Administrations program they had, and then I taught in the business school of University Extension also. I never get a job teaching political science. So we were broke by this time. While I'd been with ITT, we lived quite well, and we're off Sutton Place in New York, in a 22nd floor of a high rise and that sort of stuff. Our savings had gone steadily down while I was in school, and my wife was working at the UN and all that. But decided one of us had to get a job, and so I got a job teaching up at UC Davis in the Graduate School of Administration, and also running their business and management program at University Extension. And after about 2 years of that, I decided I was going to die broke if I didn't do something. So I decided to go back into business. I did. I went to work for a small brokerage firm in San Francisco here, but I was in Sacramento, and they were acquired by a predecessor to Smith Barney, and I spent 15 years with Smith Barney, and ultimately as a broker, money manager, had discretionary authority over fairly good sized accounts and so on. And I retired from that at the age of 67, and I've been doing a lot of volunteer work since. I just finished 8 years on the Sonoma County Area Agency on Aging. I was on the advisory council. I was chair for 2 years. I've served on the senior impact team of United Way for Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake County for about 6 years. I was on the Sonoma County General Plan Citizens Advisory County for the council for 3 years, and now I'm retired.
Now to look
Big
back
time.
on to look back on the whole thing at this point, how do you think the time that you spent in the Merchant Marine, or that experience, how do you think that maybe affected the direction you took for what you wound up doing?
I don't think I'd have ever had a life even closely resembling what I've ever had without it. I learned learned so much from it, and probably the set of values I've had for my life was formed when I was before the Merchant Marine.
Mm-hmm.
But the discipline, the structure, and the sense of responsibility that I developed in the Merchant Marine is probably what carried me through most of the rest of my life. And, you know, God bless me, I wasn't born without some intellectual capacity, so it was a consequence. But using that and using it in a manner that was good for me and good for other people at the same time was striking that balance, I think, came mostly out of those 4 years I spent in the Merchant Marine.
All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Well, thank you for listening.